There we go. So welcome, Fiona, to this presentation on teaching yoga for long COVID, chronic fatigue and burnout. And we're really looking forward to hearing about the latest updates on these issues, and also hearing more about the forthcoming training that's going to be taking place in March. So I know you've got a lot to get through, Fiona, and I'm going to pass over to you.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you all for being here, whether you're here live or watching the recording. And before I start, I just want to say that I know that I have a lot of yoga teachers who have fatigue issues themselves, either through COVID or ME or burnout. So if you don't want to look at the screen and you want to just lie down and listen, that's absolutely fine. I kind of, recommend that that's quite a good thing. I might even know anything, it's just going to be me talking. So please feel free to look away from the screen if you're more comfortable doing that. So just to say, I'm going to be introducing the concept of burnout, fatigue and long COVID and ME and how we approach this with yoga, and to explain why our approach would be very different in yoga. I'm also going to explore some of the modules on the 9-week course Sarah Ryan and myself. And the course comes in 2 parts, part 1, part 2. First part is 4 weeks, second part is 5 weeks. It's all recorded, but there is a live platform. When I say live, I mean there's a platform where you ask questions, and Julia will be explaining more about this later. So just to say, of course, we're hoping that you might sign up to our training, but if you're not interested in that, please stay with me, because today I'm still hoping to give you some really juicy content that I hope will be useful for your own teaching. So yes, there's very much more covered in the training, but you will get quite a lot of information today. And although I've got a lot to get through, there will be time for some questions afterwards as well. So I'm going to start by saying that when we're talking about fatigue, whatever we're looking at, we're describing overwhelm, burnout, ME, chronic fatigue, long COVID. We're talking about the system as being depleted of energy, prana, and very often running a chronic stress response. And of course, we're now seeing a great deal of this now, as our society is kind of changing very much more so. And I'm going to come back to this more towards the end of the talk today. So I'm going to start with some of the symptoms that we're seeing, and these will be on a spectrum. So when we're talking about chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, burnout, and long COVID, we're often seeing total exhaustion. And this might well be on the spectrum, and it's an exhaustion which will fluctuate from day to day or week to week. So some people will be able to work and maintain their social structures. Other people might be completely bedbound. We're seeing a system which is overwhelmed by minor challenges. The central nervous system, something we cover in the training, something also to do with the amygdala, part of the brain, which becomes hypersensitized through chronic stress. I also just want to mention here that I have written a book called Yoga Therapy for Stress, Burnout and Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, and it's published by Singing Dragon. Again, we hope you sign up for the training, but if you don't, the book does again go into all of what we're talking about in a lot more detail. So other symptoms apart from the fatigue are that we become overwhelmed by minor challenges. There's poor sleep, insomnia, continual flu-like symptoms, difficulty in concentrating, something we need to understand if we're teachers, because our students might not be able to follow instructions. There might be a feeling of being very detached from the body and from everyday life. We're going to look a bit more at that in a minute when we look at polyvagal theory. There might be panic attacks, anxiety, depression, memory problems, aches and joints, or even fibromyalgia, and this is because of chronic inflammation. And basically dysregulation of the system. Another common symptom is something called POTS, or postural tachycardia syndrome. So this is, I'm going to cover this more when we get into long COVID, but this is to do with blood pressure changes, particularly affects us when we're transitioning maybe from lying to kneeling or kneeling to standing. And it means that our blood pressure sets up a variation which causes a rapid heartbeat, which can be very alarming for people. So we have to be very careful when we're transitioning people when they're doing yoga. So what I would like to do now is just to cover a couple of models of stress so that we can understand what might be happening within our system. So we can understand our autonomic nervous system as a network which monitors our environment to see if we are safe or not. So there's always this, our system is always looking, are there threats or not coming into our system? And our vagus nerve plays an important part of this. So our vagus nerve is a vital part of our autonomic nervous system, and it's the main nerve associated with the parasympathetic nervous system. So it's a nerve which travels from our brain, and it wraps itself around all our major organs of the body, including the heart or lungs, and it sends information to our neural organs with this sense of whether there's danger or not. And it's fundamentally responsible for helping the body to come back into a state of relaxation or homeostasis. And this is why there's so much talk about it currently in yoga circles, particularly within yoga therapy. The vagus nerve is very much affected by sound, particularly mid-range sounds. And we can help our vagus nerve, our vagal tone, with certain yoga breathing, which we're going to look at later, and also with chanting and sounding. So polyvagal theory, which was developed by Stephen Porges, suggests that there are 3 responses to any experience in life. So there's what's known as the ventral vagal system, and this is when our vagus nerve is in tone. And this is also known as the rest and relaxation division. It's about our social interaction, when we feel safe and joyful, how present we are, and how we are able to engage successfully with others. It also affects our facial expressions, so we feel accepted and safe, and how we're able to respond to smiling, how we interpret tones of voice. It's all about this feeling of safety. When we're in the vagal system, our heart is stronger, our digestion is more effective, and in this state we can access feelings of empathy, compassion, and this feeling of being connected, which is exactly how we want to be ourselves and how we want our students to be. Then the second thing concerned in polyvagal theory is sympathetic nervous system, and this is known as the fight or flight response. And I think you're probably all aware of this if you're a yoga teacher. This is when our HPA axis releases chemicals like cortisol and adrenaline. We might see the facial muscles flatten.
Yeah, I'm just on a
and we become. Sorry, Julia, can you put everyone on mute for me? Thank you. And we become more sensitive to higher or lower frequencies to alert us to danger. So when we're in sympathetic nervous system arousal, we might have a bias towards fear in order to protect us. And this is something we're seeing so much now from the pandemic. I'm going to cover this again in a minute. But what this presents as is somebody who will be in a hyperventilation pattern with a faster heart rate, tense muscles, blood draining from major organs, and in a chronic stress pattern, the amygdala may be hyper-responding to even small doses. This is a really common scenario that we're seeing in classes these days. People with stiff necks, stiff shoulders, breathing from the upper chest rather than diaphragm, maybe breathing from the mouth because people are locked in this chronic stress pattern. And then the final part of polyvagal theory is known as the dorsal vagal system. So this describes a freeze response that can occur from life-threatening situations such as overwhelming stress or trauma. So this is a shutdown protective mechanism. It's associated with a feeling of being very detached, disassociated from the world, and not being in the body. A feeling of being unreal, a feeling of being numb, and it presents as a lack of emotion or empathy, and it can continue long after original trauma has passed. So it's something that we see in post-traumatic stress disorder. It's actually a protective mechanism to extreme stress. So somebody who's experienced trauma and chronic stress might well swing between sympathetic nervous system hyperarousal and the dorsal vagal, ventral vagal division for this shutdown. So we might see a student being very highly reactive and anxious, or really shut down and uninterested and disassociated from their current experience. So our aim as yoga teachers is to ease somebody back to what's known as a window of tolerance, out of this swing between sympathetic nervous system and shutdown, and back to ventral vagal system dominance, so they can reconnect with their bodies and rediscover the joy of being present, grounded, and relaxed. So many of the people I work with ME or long COVID will have experienced trauma or even ACEs, known as adverse childhood experiences. So a lot of this is also because of trauma just from living in a dysfunctional society. And there's much more about this covered in the training when we look at how our society impacts on us, and therefore our ability to recover from ME or long COVID. Another important module I cover in the training, I think it's around week 3 of part 1, is about the mitochondria. So if you don't know what mitochondria are, they are known as organelles, but they are the energy spark of our cell. And I could say they equate to prana, but that's not quite accurate. So prana is something slightly different, but here we are talking about energy. So our mitochondria, known as ATP, and this is adenosine triphosphate, and this is the fuel for our cell. And our cells, our mitochondria, need nutrients, and one of the most important one is oxygen. And this is all about how oxygen is actually taken to our cells. So this is not about deep breathing, but it's about how we breathe. So I'm just going to talk very briefly here about the response. Again, much more about this is covered in the training. So Dr. Robert Naveau, Professor of Medicine at the University of California, suggests it's how our mitochondria function that is the answer to chronic fatigue states. And this would include burnout and long COVID. He says that as well as producing energy, our mitochondria are also involved in defending every cell of the body if we perceive we're under threat. So it's this idea being, are we under threat or are we safe again? It's so important when we're talking about these conditions. The more that mitochondria are needed to work in defense mode, the less energy they produce. And Naveau calls it the cell danger response. So as I say, in the training, you'll learn more about this, but if you want to look it up, you would look up cell danger response. The more that mitochondria are defending us from something, the less energy they're producing. They're not producing ATP so effectively, and the cells, the mitochondria, are caught in a repeating loop of incomplete recovery and injury. And this response is triggered by encounters with chemicals, physical or biological threats. And the thesis is that this persistence of the cell danger response for many diseases. So the kind of things which trigger the cell danger response is inflammation from chronic stress. This is emotional or physical stress. And this includes overdoing things or exercising too much. Poor diet, allergies and sensitivities to food, toxins in the environment, pollution, reduced oxygen to the cell, which I've already mentioned. And you know that research is showing that there is a problem with oxygen uptake in ME and chronic fatigue states. So this is where yoga is so important. A fermenting gut and a unhealthy microbiome can trigger the cell danger response. Some prescription drugs and viruses, chronic infections, and bacteria such as toxins, and of course COVID itself. Other things include mold toxins in the atmosphere, overgrowth of parasites, and potentially electromagnetic fields. So what we are looking at in yoga is how we can turn the cell danger response back on. And obviously this is not simple, but we have a huge role to play if we're teaching yoga in a program. So having, just very briefly touched on the cell danger response to mitochondria and polyvagal theory, and now I'm going to look at a little bit more about long COVID, and I'm now moving on to more about what we teach and cover in part 2 of the training. So I'm going to just go through some statistics first. So 59% of people who've had COVID-19 are reporting symptoms 4 months after they've had the diagnosis. And based on infections reported globally at a year ago, so this is looking at mid-October 2021, more than 100 million people worldwide had experienced lingering health concerns or still reporting problems following a COVID infection. And according to the National Office of Statistics, 1.5 million people were reporting symptoms lasting more than a month after having had COVID. And of this, 685,000 people had or suspected they had COVID-19 at least a year previously. So this is really quite concerning. In other words, a year after having had a COVID infection are still having symptoms. And we are calling this long COVID. So my view on this is that if somebody has a COVID infection and they know that they've had a COVID infection, and it doesn't need to be severe, because we're hearing people who've had Omicron quite mildly, then going on to develop long COVID. My view is that if you've had an infection, you should be resting and convalescing and pacing yourself up to 12 weeks to 6 months after you've had that infection. And unfortunately, we are losing our ability, or we're not convalescing like we were 30, 40 years ago, because it's not done in our culture to convalesce. But if we don't convalesce, then we are going to develop post-viral fatigue. And clearly long COVID is a post-viral fatigue type illness. So 65 of this group presenting with long COVID symptoms are saying that they are affected in their day-to-day activities. The most affected in this group, and again, this is the National Office of Statistics, are females aged 35 to 49 years, those in deprived areas, those involved in teaching, social or healthcare. And this is probably because of their exposure to the virus, but it's also, in my view, because of the pressure to go back to work too quickly. And anecdotally, we're now seeing long COVID in children and younger people. And I'm currently working on a book on long COVID and yoga with a friend of mine who's had long COVID, Nadine Mackay. I've had ME incidentally, so this is my interest, and Lyme, this is my interest in fatigue conditions. And both Nadine and I really believe that people who go on to develop long COVID will have been involved in having, or they've had a pattern of hyperventilation, chronic stress, and they're not convalescing properly. So, there's a really valid considerations when we're looking at long COVID. And, we really do have to look at our society's samskaras of push, drive and achieve, and how convalescence is no longer valued. So when we're looking at symptoms of long COVID, fatigue is the most common symptom reported. And again, as with ME, it has this relapse remitting pattern, which isn't always obvious. And then other symptoms include shortness of breath, loss of smell, difficulty in sleeping, anxiety and depression, heart palpitations, chest tightness or pain, joint or muscle pain, brain fog. I think I've mentioned smell or taste changes, persistent cough, postural tachycardia, POTS, the thing I mentioned before about getting off the mat very quickly, we have to be careful of. And also something known as mast cell activation, which I'm not going to go into detail here, it's in the training more, but this is to do with histamine intolerance, which can lead to allergies. So we have to be very careful with use of things like incense. So clearly we're dealing with a host of symptoms. We might be dealing with trauma and fear, breathing problems, hyperventilation. We definitely need a particular approach. Now, the NHS has set up long COVID clinics throughout the UK, and some of their current treatments include aerobic exercise, which they do build up slowly. However, anecdotally, many patients are reporting that these treatments don't always work, and that resting, pacing, and yoga are much more helpful. Post-exertion malaise, which is called, we know this is PEM, is a real big thing. That means after somebody has done too much movement or exercise, they relapse. And they might not relapse the next day. This can be like the second or third day. And then that relapse might last for many days. So this means that if somebody comes to a class and they do exercise or movement, they might appear to be fine, but they then go back and they relapse. So this is where as teachers, we have to be so careful. So in conclusion, from our point of view of teachers, it's vital to understand that many people who have had COVID end up exhausted, and they might even have experienced their illness as something that's traumatic. So what we're looking at, and again, what we cover much more in the training, is helping someone to learn to regulate the breath back to a healthy breathing pattern, helping to calm and down and regulate the central nervous system, and helping someone to come out of a chronic stress or shutdown response. So we're looking at the breath in a very specific way. But we also have to be careful when we look at the breath, because if people have had trauma, sometimes looking at the breath itself can be traumatic. So this is again something that we cover. So we're looking at breathing and teaching in a way that's not going to exacerbate symptoms. I say this from long experience of working with yoga teachers with ME, because there's still a culture of promoting strong asana and exercise and doing, or strong pranayama, and this can cause symptoms to worsen, and this can be very devastating. So obviously we don't want to create a relapse scenario. So in yogic terms, we're always looking at how we can help more with the effective flow of prana. So we might start by just learning and teaching someone to nostril breathe, and that might not be easy for somebody who's had COVID or who's been stuck in a hyperventilation pattern. So we have to do this in stages. We have to lead up to this, and because somebody might have had trauma, we're always offering choice, because we want to give somebody back their agency. So when teaching someone to rebreathe, or to breathe healthily, we're thinking of the Yoga Sutras, which is slow and subtle. We're also thinking of the science, which is light, slow and low. We're thinking about the diaphragm. And in a minute, we're going to do a breathing exercise together. I also just want to introduce here that there is something in the training about nitric oxide. So nitric oxide is a really useful natural gas which is generated in our reservoirs, in the sinuses, produced naturally with nostril breathing. It's a vascular dilator and it helps protect us against viruses and bacteria. And it's increased when we do humming. So things like the Brahmani breath can be really helpful. And it also helps to engage the vagus nerve. So let's just come now to do a practice. So if you like to just come to a comfortable sitting position. And just take a moment or two to check in with yourself. So think about your posture being upright if you can. So think about loosening the neck and the shoulders, having the neck fine, creating space between the tailbone and the top of the head. We're just going to take one hand and place it on the heart and the other hand on the belly. I'll come back a bit if you are looking at me, but actually it might be quite nice to close your eyes now. And just check in that you're breathing into the hand that's on the belly. So the hand on the heart is pacifying the chest. Close your eyes if it's comfortable. And think about this idea of breathing slow and low. Breathing through the nose if it's comfortable. If it's not, just breathe in your normal way. This is just something that we are aiming for. You don't have to do it. What I'm saying is just a suggestion. It's not an instruction. And then for 5 breaths, we're going to just hum the breath out through pursed lips to encourage a longer exhalation. So inhale through the nose if that's comfortable. Humming the breath out. 4 more times in your own breathing rhythm. I won't join in with you because your breathing pitch may be very different from mine. And when you finish, if you like to drop your hands, it just helps me to see that you've finished. And then just take a moment or two to observe any effects that that's had on your system. So that's just an example of a breath that we might teach. Another one that we teach is coherent breathing, also known as samana breathing. So samana is one of the 5 pranas. The samana is concerned with equal inhale, equal exhale. Sarah Ryan says more about this when we look at prana. So coherent breathing is described by Heather Mason of the Minded Institute as breathing in for 6, breathing out for 6, and for around 5 breaths a minute. Now, many people with long COVID can't actually manage that. So we might start breathing in for 3 and out for 3, but it's an equal inhale and equal exhalation. But this breath has been used in hospitals and it's been shown to reduce inflammation, increase cognitive function. It's a very calming breath. But remember, we're always working at the pace of the student. So this might be something that's too much for them and that we're leading up to it. Because we're always offering choice when we teach, because we are teaching in a manner that is trauma informed. And that means that we have to offer choice, because when people have been traumatized, often they've lost their sense of agency. And this is something we want to bring back. Just to say also, in yoga therapy, we start with exhalation. So exhalation is known as the energy of apana. Again, there's much more about this in part 2 of the training. So the apana is the energy of letting go, the energy of detoxification. But we always start with helping the exhalation to be long and smooth, because this also helps to engage the parasympathetic nervous system, helping to down regulate the nervous system. We also cover in the training the importance of this interaction between carbon dioxide and the uptake of oxygen to the cell, because when we want we want to increase this flow of prana, we want the mitochondria to be more effective with taking in oxygen. And this isn't just about oxygen, it's also about carbon dioxide. It has this role too. So how we breathe and when we breathe, and not over breathing, is also very, very important. And anecdotally, I have heard 2 doctors say, this is anecdotally, that people were dying in COVID, during COVID, because of this problem to the cell. So this idea that we can help people to uptake oxygen more effectively in yoga, it's really, really important. So we want to be looking at how we move the diaphragm and how we might get the diaphragm moving again, because in many cases it might be stuck. So for this, we're looking at certain postures. So for example, one of the things we teach is pronation. Pronation means lying on our fronts, something that hospitals are doing for people with COVID, because if people have breathing difficulties, often they find it more comfortable to lie on their fronts. So the kind of thing we might do is get people to lie on their front, feeling the belly against the floor, so that as they're inhaling, they're feeling that sensation of the belly against the floor, and exhaling, gently taking the navel to the spine, or breathing into the back when we're lying on the floor. And then the kind of asana that we're teaching that supports posture will be things like gentle cobra or bhujangasana, and this can be supported, bridge, lying on the front over cushions or bolsters, neck stimulation to help clear the lymph. And obviously we're avoiding inversions for obvious reasons, because they're going to interfere with breathing. So everything we're doing is about helping the diaphragm to mobilize, and also about mobilizing the spine. So now I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about how in this training we are covering a little bit about teaching a trauma-informed approach. So on, I think it's week 3 in part 2, I also invite somebody called Aneta Idchik to come onto the training, because she is a trauma specialist. She's actually taught with Julia for Yoga Teachers Forum, and she also runs her own trauma training. But in my view, most people with ME or COVID will have had some experience of trauma. So although this is not trauma training, it definitely is trauma-informed training. So this is covered much more in part 2 of the training. I'm going to say a little bit more about it now. So yoga teachers are seeing an increase in our classes in stress, burnout and fatigue. And when I was putting part 2 of the training together, I wanted to look at how world events were impacting on us, because yoga therapists say that we're not separate from our environment. So, of course it's going to impact on us. It's going to inform our central nervous system. So I was making a list, and I was quite surprised with what I came up with. And certainly I don't want to alarm you when I read out the list, but I just kind of am reading out this list to say this is what we're dealing with in our classes. So things like lockdown, school and university closures, homeschooling, isolation, having COVID and its implications on health, fear of having COVID, fear of reinfection, messages by the media to be afraid and to avoid people, visual sight of masks, feeling of loss of control, vaccination fears for and against, causing fear on both sides, and division. Divisions actively stoked and amplified by the media, misinformation, not knowing what is true anymore, not knowing what is conspiracy, shaming, polarization, feeling those in charge have lost control, seeing the vulnerable, like low-income nurses, care workers being taken advantage of, financial uncertainty, cost of living crisis, returning well. General globalization uncertainty, such as global warming, war in Ukraine, increase in racism, fear of future, food shortages, oil prices, unstable markets, future pandemic fears, and so it goes on. Now, I mention all this because I've already said that our health depends on our central nervous system being healthy. And central nervous system is about how we perceive how safe we are or not. And one definition of trauma is that our nervous system is overwhelmed, so it can't actually process what is happening. And it gets stuck in low or high arousal. We saw that when we looked at polyvagal theory. In other words, trauma can said to be happened when our capacity to process and integrate our experience is overwhelmed. And from this, our sense of self may fragment. And one consequence of this is that we lose agency, we lose trust in ourselves. And, so much of this has happened in the last 3 years. And of course, this is added to if we have a history of trauma. So healing and our work as yoga teachers is about helping this metabolism of unprocessed trauma by bringing a sense of safety and compassion in our teaching, so that this process can happen in a way that was previously unavailable, and so that our students are not flooded continually with sensation of overwhelming continual arousal, and so they're not stuck in this time machine of chronic stress or trauma. And I want to just add here that we can't think our way out of trauma. It's something that's very much body-centered, and we need to help our students learn resources so that, resources can process their overwhelming sensations. So the kind of tools we cover in the training include tapping, stroking, somatic work. So by somatic, I mean coming back into the body, but always remembering that everything has to be offered slowly and as a choice. Because to somebody who's traumatized, even relaxing can be perceived as threatening, because somebody might be very hypervigilant and not want to let their guard down. So, we have to be aware of this. So, as I say, we cover trauma in the, I'm just kind of looking at my notes. We cover trauma in some detail in the training. And the kind of thing we might see in our classes, the way that anxiety, trauma, hyperarousal might present, the kind of thing we want to look for in a student, we might see hyperventilation, ragged breathing, stiff neck, stiff shoulders, tight jaw, darting eyes, somebody who's not able to sit still, fast speech, difficulty in focusing, agitation. Or alternatively, if somebody is shut down, we might see them as disengaged, hunched, closed down body posture, because they're protecting their heart, crushed diaphragm, head dropped, difficulty in relaxing or following instructions. We might see our students rush through postures, trying to get somewhere, being very goal orientated. We might be like this ourselves. So, of course, this is something we have to address in ourselves. And I see this as very hard for people with long COVID, because they're still very much engaged in a society where we are being taught to rush and to produce. So they're kind of still learning about pacing. We can help teach people to pace in the yoga class, so that they can then take lessons like this off the mat. A big one I also see with my students is actual fear of their symptoms. They find their body frightening, they find their fatigue frightening. And in fact, the fatigue at times can be so profound, it's literally terrifying. So this is why people don't want to be in their bodies, and they don't want to be in the present moment. They find it all too much. So just a reminder, our nervous system is concerned with, am I under threat or am I safe? And we want to help our students to self-regulate and to feel safe and connected. And we do this by co-regulation. And what this means is that we rely on people around us for co-regulation to help us to feel safe. And this is really important, because this is where we as yoga teachers can help. This is about us connecting and holding space and a sense of safety for our students. Because in order to self-regulate, our students need a reliable regulating other, because this helps them to build experiences of trust and safety. As teachers, we're responsible for being regulated ourselves, so we can be this regulating presence for our students. So this means we need to be predictable, reliable, calm, open, friendly, smiling, accepting, and non-judgmental. Because our students might not trust us until they're confident that we understand their condition, but we're not going to push them. We're not going to do too much movement. We're not going to talk too much, give them too much instruction, which might exhaust them or take away their healthy sense of agency. So we do this through language, tone and pace of our voice, our facial expressions, which are a sign of safety and connection, open gestures, eye contact, authentic smiling, deep listening, open gestures. So these are kind of tools that we cover in the training, which hold our student in safety, so that they know that we won't let them down. And this is so important in helping somebody to heal. And I just kind of want to start to conclude by saying that many of our students will have an experience of disconnection from their body because of fatigue and trauma and stress. So we're helping them to have a safe awareness of their body-based sensation and the ability to be able to turn towards their sensations, so that even difficult sensations like pain or fatigue, they no longer feel so afraid of. And they can do this if we are holding this safe space for them without pushing them. And there's a kind of ladder that we do this with. So I talk about helping our students, first of all, to develop awareness of their symptoms and their sensations, and then to turn towards this with acceptance. And then we build up to non-judgment, kindness, compassion, and even love. And what we're doing this kind of somatically. This body connection means we're gently helping our students experience their body, focusing on the different parts, so they can be helped to release and discharge stuck and suppressed emotions. And in time, this helps to increase a tolerance of different feelings, so their emotions can move through to complete a cycle. This helps to release a stuck nervous system where the energy of fight, flight, or freeze may have been trapped. So this in turn is going to help us to have more energy. Consequently, micro breaks and pacing are really important because they help our student to listen in more, so that they then learn to avoid this push crash pattern that they might be, and they learn how to pace, and they start to listen into their bodies more and apply something called neuroception, which is this sense of listening in as they learn to trust their bodies more. So there's much more about this in the training around the pranas, the chakras, the pranayama, and yoga therapy itself. But I hope this gives a taster. And in a minute, I'm going to open it up for questions and also pass over to Julia, who might want to say the training. But I just want to say, remember my book, Yoga Therapy for Stress, Burnout and Chronic Fatigue Syndrome. And also just to mention that I have 2 Facebook groups. So I set up a Facebook group for yoga teachers about a year ago, and it's called Yoga Teachers with Fatigue Support. And that's not in any way to promote my work. This is just support because so many yoga teachers I noticed had a history of long COVID or ME. And there's now about 150 teachers on the group. So if you are watching this and you've got fatigue yourself and you're a yoga teacher or a yoga therapist and you'd like some support, please do come and join us on that group. I also have a yoga group called what's it called? It's called Restful Yoga for Fatigue with Fiona. So that is for people I teach. I'm actually not teaching at the moment because I'm writing a book, but that is a very supportive, very positive group where we share things around yoga. And so that's another resource. And I also have a website, which is my name. So if you Google my name, it will come up. So now I'm going to open it up in a minute for questions, but I just would like to invite Julia, who might like to say something more about the training, and then pass over for questions. So Julia, can I pass over to you?
Yeah, so I'll clarify about the training. I've been popping things in the chat as people have been asking questions as well. But for those of you who are maybe watching on Facebook or don't have access to the chat, Fiona's been referring to part 1 and part 2 throughout the talk. Now part 1 and part 2 have been amalgamated into a 9-week training. The start date is in March. I'm just going to have the start date is on the 13th of March. The sessions have been recorded, but they're going to be released on a Monday each week, and you can watch those recordings at any time during the week. The intention behind that is to make the training as nervous system friendly as possible, and to make it available to people who might have fatigue issues themselves. I will pin myself because Fiona has unpinned, so I'll just pin myself so that you can see me. There you go. Here I am. It starts on the 13th of March. The reason why each of the sessions is released weekly is because there's a lot of content to absorb, and it'll give you the opportunity to absorb that content, think about what questions you might want to ask. And then within the online platform, you've got the opportunity to ask questions of Fiona, and she will see those questions. And you can ask questions in one of 3 ways. You can ask questions by writing them. You can ask questions by clicking an audio function, and you can also ask questions by uploading a video. So for instance, if you're not sure about a particular asana, you might want to practice it and say, here's a video of me doing this little asana thing. Would this be suitable? Would this not be suitable for the audience that I'm working with? I'm going to, well, yeah, Fiona's coming back. If you've got any other questions about how the course runs, then do feel free to pop that in the chat as we go along. After the training is completed, you don't lose it. It is there for you to go back to. Bear in mind that this was training that evolved through the knowledge that was gained throughout the COVID period. So some of the content might relate to actually what was unfolding in time, but what we have learned now that the training is complete, and Fiona can tell me if this is wrong or right, but now that the training is complete, some of the things that were surmised and thought that might be the case as COVID was unfolding, that has come to be true now. So when Fiona said, oh, this may be the case, like the correlation between long COVID and chronic fatigue, that has played out and proven to be true through the research that's been done with the medical establishments that Fiona has connections to. So, that is, it's kind of useful to know that things that they thought would be true have come to be true. Now that I'm going to go to the questions.
Can I just very quickly add to that I'm also teaching this with the wonderful Sarah Ryan, who used to be my yoga teacher, and she's hugely knowledgeable as a yoga therapist. And that I think, did you mention, Julia, that we are both available for answering questions throughout the course, on the platform. And also, just to add, without wanting to take up too much time on this, it is extremely interesting, really, what Julia says, because when we started the training, it ran in March 2021. And yes, we were seeing long COVID, but it has kind of grown organically. And no doubt there will be more that will be added through your questions, on that platform. So the other thing is, if any of you are watching and you have done part 1 separately, don't forget that part 2 is available separately for you if that's what you would want to do. But if you've got more, we'll answer questions now, but if you've got more questions, you are, of course, welcome to contact around the training. So yes, Julia, do you want to read out the questions in the chat?
So for those of you who've been joining us online for the recording is going to end now, and we're going to, but do feel free, there'll be ways for you to ask questions if you've been watching the recording. So I'm just going to stop the recording now. Oh, where we go? Stop recording.